Now, I spent some time over the weekend doing something I don't ordinarily do. I read the Washington Post. We get it for the comics. I usually don't read it. I look at the headlines, make sure the world hasn't exploded, and then I put it down. But greeting me yesterday morning was this big front page story about the evils of gun ownership and the evils of gun stores. And I sat down and I read this thing. They had a follow-up piece today. In fact, I kind of want to start with this follow-up piece, Larry, because there's such rewriting of history going on here. Today's piece in the Washington Post was about, in large part, about the TR Amendment. And there was a quote by Chuck Wexler, director of the Police Executive Research Forum. And he says, quote, speaking of the TR Amendment, "It was extraordinary and the most offensive thing you can think of. The tracing data, which is now secret, helped us see the big picture of where guns are coming from." The only problem with that statement, Larry, is that police officers weren't stopped from getting a hold of ATF trace data.
Oh, I was just going to say.
Even after the TR Amendment was passed.
Yeah, it's always been a canard that somehow the TR Amendment prevents law enforcement from seeing trace data. That is false, and it has always been false. And when people like Chuck Wexler or Mayor Bloomberg or the Brady Center make that assertion, they're simply either seriously uninformed or they're intentionally distorting the truth in order to advance their anti-gun agenda. Law enforcement has never been denied access to the trace data. Now, it has always been true, even before the TR Amendment, that ATF would never release to City A information about traces taking place in City B. And the reason for that, and the reason for the TR Amendment in general, was because it could place law enforcement officers in City B, in this hypothetical, at risk if they gave information about City A and they started, engaging in, let's say, simulated straw purchases, as Mayor Bloomberg did through his private eyes.
Yeah.
And that's the whole point behind the TR Amendment, is that information should not be outside of law enforcement because it can place law enforcement officers and witnesses and even gun dealers who may be cooperating with law enforcement at risk and interfere in investigations. That's why the TR Amendment exists. That's why, for example, FOP supports the TR Amendment, as do others in law enforcement. And, in fact, as does ATF, because it prevents the misuse of that data for purposes for which it does not exist. It does not exist so that the Brady Center or Mayor Bloomberg and his merry band of misguided mayors can generate, politicized so-called reports to advance their political agenda, which is to restrict private ownership of firearms in the United States.
Yeah, this is such a weird story. I mean, they talk about the TR Amendment. They go into what I guess people who don't know this issue, they're going to think they're reading the real history of the TR Amendment. They never mention that they call it They call it a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit that was pushing for contemporaneous data. No, this was a suit filed by Chicago Mayor Richard Daley, seeking to get ATF trace data from
national, not just for the
right,
city of Chicago.
Not just for Chicago.
National data for the city of Chicago's lawsuit against the firearms industry.
That's right. This wasn't a FOIA lawsuit. This was a lawsuit that was designed to go after the gun industry.
Right. They FOIA'd the information from ATF. ATF denied that information to the city of Chicago. And then the city of Chicago brought a lawsuit under the FOIA Act, the Freedom of Information Act, to try to, get the information, force a court to order ATF to give them the data. Mm-hmm. That case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. While the case was pending before the Supreme Court and before it had been argued, or briefed and argued, I don't recall, but certainly before it had been argued, Congress passed the TR Amendment because of what was going on in the city of Chicago lawsuit, as well as what was also going on in front of Judge Weinstein in the NAACP lawsuit, where Judge Weinstein was ordering trace data to be returned over by ATF, largely over ATF's objections, and even earlier efforts by Weinstein and the plaintiff's lawyer in the Hamilton case to get access to trace information. And remember, the entire backbone of the municipal lawsuits that were pursued against the industry, chiefly by the Brady Center and other anti-gun groups, backed by George Soros, among others, to finance those lawsuits, was trace data. And what did they use trace data to do? Despite the fact that ATF always said, even coming back to the days of the Clinton administration, ATF always say, and in fact is required now by law to say, if they release data on tracing, to say that the fact that there's been a trace doesn't mean anybody in the stream of commerce has done anything wrong. And it does. You cannot use trace information to conclude that because a dealer has a trace or more than one trace, that they're a bad apple dealer, as the Brady Center likes to speak about, or as Joe Vince, their private retained expert, said in one of the Washington Post clips today, that they equate tracing with being corruption on the part of a licensee, even though ATF says you cannot conclude that. And so they use trace information as a proxy for actual evidence of wrongdoing. And tracing information and its use in civil litigation was the cornerstone of the municipal lawsuits against the industry, which thankfully failed. And that was part of the reason why the Tiahrt Amendment was put in place as well, is because this information was being misused outside of law enforcement for civil litigation that had a political agenda behind it, and it was jeopardizing law enforcement.
So, Larry, I got to ask, I mean, when you see this type of, big, sweeping, quote-unquote journalism by the Washington Post, Oprah is spending an hour with a gun control advocate. NBC News was reporting last week you can buy a .50 caliber machine gun and assault rifles over the counter in gun stores. I mean, we've seen a ton of media.
You know what that tells me?
What does it tell you?
Next Tuesday's election day.
All right. So, what do you mean by that, though?
I think it would be foolish not to suspect that the timing of this is, it's not coincidental. The timing of all of this really suggests to me a coordinated an attempt to raise the issue for political purposes right before the election.
Do you think, Larry, that this is going to continue after the
yes,
election?
Yes, absolutely. I have no doubt.
Really?
But yes.
Interesting.
Yeah. We definitely believe that the issue is starting to heat up again politically, where it has been fairly quiet, and in large measure, people were saying, that elections were not part of this election. I think if you go back and look at the EPA issue, and all this other stuff we just talked about, I think it's now become part of the election.
Well, I think that you're right. And for instance, in Pennsylvania, in the Senate race between Pat Toomey and Joe Sestak, at the last debate, George Stephanopoulos, or I guess debate before last, Stephanopoulos brought up Senator Lautenberg's no-fly, no-buy bill. And he repeated the Brady line of argument here that, if you're on a no-fly list, you'd be able to buy a gun. And Joe Sestak said, oh, absolutely, of course, we've got to do something to protect the terrorists. It was Pat Toomey who pointed out, not everybody on this list is a criminal. Not everybody on this list is suspected of being a criminal. We have to ensure that we protect the Second Amendment rights of law-abiding Americans while going after the people who want to do us harm.
We already know from past published reports, including even in the New York Times, that the no-fly list is really a mess. And there are lots and lots of Americans who are on that list for the wrong reasons. They're not actually terrorists. They're not suspected of being terrorists. Ted Kennedy was on that list at one point.
Sure, Congressman John Lewis.
And it is harder for law enforcement to put somebody on that list than it is to put somebody on the terrorist watch list. If you go back and read the report published by the Government Accounting Office, it's harder. The standard for putting somebody on the no-fly list is higher than it is to put on this so-called terrorist watch list. And so this terrorist watch list is supposed to be, this list of suspected terrorists. And as Senator Lindsey Graham at a hearing over the summer pointed out, the vast majority of those individuals that would be on that list are not U.S. citizens, and they couldn't go into a gun store in the United States and buy a gun anyway. And all but a precious few of them aren't even in the United States.
Yeah.
So, and it's important for people to understand that when somebody purchases a firearm, those lists are checked by the FBI when they do the background check through NICS. And if somebody is on the list and it gets flagged, law enforcement is contacted. The agency that put that person on the list gets contacted so that they can be aware and take whatever investigative steps would be appropriate, if any. Because, again, you could be on that list simply because you went to high school with somebody,
right,
or you live down the block from somebody, or you have the cubicle next door to somebody, and not that you did anything. And so, again, they just want to try any way they can to deny law-abiding citizens their Second Amendment rights. In any way that they can frustrate the lawful possession and commerce in firearms, they will attempt it. And this is just another example.
All right. Well, Larry, we're going to keep our eyes on the mainstream media, and if they continue this series of the Washington Post, we may invite you back on.
Well, they definitely are going to continue the series. I think it's going to last all week. And ironically, some of the stories have even, pointed out the fact that the dealers are not, like the story about Realco or the story about Bob's Gun Shop in Norfolk, Virginia. Mm-hmm. They have a lot of traces. Oh, they must be bad guys. Well, you talk to law enforcement, even in the case of the Bob's Gun Shop, for example. That clip is online on the Washington Post website. ATF doesn't think he's a bad guy. Local law enforcement in Virginia, in Norfolk, doesn't think he's a bad guy. They just happen to sell a lot of firearms, and so they have some traces, but that doesn't mean that they're a bad guy. But the headline on the article sure makes it sound like he's a bad guy, doesn't it?
It certainly does, and you're absolutely right. I think even with Realco, they had a quote from one of the local law enforcement who says, we work with them, they work with us, we have a good relationship with them. But you're right. The Washington Post clearly looking for villains, and if they can't find one, they'll go ahead and call somebody a villain regardless. When
I read those the Realco piece, for example, it was like this is a textbook example of why the TRO Amendment is necessary, because they're. That article, if you just read that headline, you would think they're a bad guy, they're a bad dealer, they're a corrupt dealer, and they're not. And you see the Brady Center put out their bad apple dealer list a number of years ago before the TRO Amendment, and they were chastised by ATF for doing that. And even in the piece that's up on the website now, you have Joe Vince, who has been paid to testify against the industry in a number of lawsuits, including the NAACP lawsuit, and the Hamilton case and others, getting up there and saying that if a dealer has traces, they're a bad guy. And he knows that that's not true.
Yeah.
He knows, as having run the tracing branch for ATF, that's not true.
Absolutely. Larry, thank you again, sir, for coming on the program. It's always a real pleasure to get a chance to talk with you, and look forward to doing it again very soon.
Glad to spend time with you, Cam.
Larry Keane, Vice President and General Counsel of the National Shooting Sports Foundation, joining us here on Cam & Company.